We're just going to get started here. We know that some folks are going to continue to sort of trickle in. It's still pretty early, but we just wanted to say hi, welcome to the Center for Election Sciences, and as we call him, JP, our training on how to write and place op-eds, because writing is just one part of the process here. We want to welcome everyone, and please feel encouraged to write an introduction in the chat. We will have some time at the end of the training to have a little bit of a Q&A, but we will also be reading questions from the chat. So for example, if you do have to drop early, let's say you find yourself like 10 minutes, like, oh, I'm not going to be able to make that. You can drop your question in the chat and I'll read it. And then we make it a habit of sending around the recording and the notes after each of these trainings. So you will see it answered in the chat, or rather in the video that we'll send around after. So if you do have that burning question or just any comment, we can address it in the chat and make sure. Yes, I'm very happy to see some folks already chiming in, saying hello. Don't worry, we're a friendly community, and we are very happy that you are here. I will pass it over to Nina Taylor.
Hey everybody, I'm Nina Taylor. If we've not met, I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science, and I just very briefly would like to bring greetings and welcome to you all for our learning hour today on how to write a compelling op-ed. Just thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. And this is so important to us because, as you all know, how information is consumed has radically transformed. So according to Pew Research, 86% of Americans get their news from their digital devices, with social media and video platforms overtaking traditional TV as primary news sources for many demographics. This means our messaging has to be everywhere that the conversations are happening. The good thing about this new media landscape is that how SEO has changed, and how it works now is very different than how it worked before. And so now it's about highlighting the voices of the many and driving a wider network of credible perspectives that add strength and legitimacy to a movement. And so when 10 different thoughtful people, or in this case, 15 different thoughtful people, write articles about approval voting, that creates a powerful signal that the movement is real and gaining momentum. And so today, while the examples will focus on approval voting, because let's be honest, that is just our jam, JP will remind you that the tips and strategies could be really adapted to anything that you're interested in, whether it's redistricting or voting reform, or even what's happening in your communities. As I always say with our virtual events, be curious, ask questions, and let's just dive in and learn how we can amplify our messages to make sure that our collective voices are heard. Over to you, JP.
Yeah, thanks, Nina and Allison and everyone else over at the Center for Election Science. My name is Jean-Paul Ciardullo. JP's easier. Very happy to be here today. I was honored to get the invite. And in my day job is I'm an attorney. I'm a partner at a large law firm called Foley & Lardner. I do litigation. I'm in court arguing cases about breach of contract and patent infringement and that kind of thing. But about 15 years ago, outside of work, I became very interested in voting reform issues. My own angle on it was, and this dovetailed a little bit with my litigation work, is there some sort of almost game theory way of arriving at a best result in an election that makes the most people happy? It seemed to me that the things in nature, this was also partly my training undergrad. I was an engineer before I went into law, and it's sort of a merger of these concepts. I was thinking, most things in the natural world fall on a bell curve, and how do you maximize the ability to have the most people on that center of that bell curve represented in politics instead of it being polarized? And I sort of set on my own, came into approval voting doing spreadsheet simulations of different elections, and then sort of reverse engineered it and looked it up and found it was, hey, that's a real thing people know about and have been advocating for a long time. And I got hooked up with the Center for Election Science some years ago I've done some work with them. And I also had started more recently to try to get into writing some op-eds. I have several different ones right now that are sort of in the works that kind of keep editing them and trying to improve them. I had one published on an online journal called The Fulcrum that maybe some of you know of. And then after that, one with the Salt Lake Tribune. And I'm working on getting another one out now. But in the course of looking into this, I feel like I kind of picked up a lot of sort of information and pointers, maybe some stuff people already know about, but I thought I'd kind of put it all in one place. Now, as Nina said, I kind of have my own thing is approval voting. I put that sort of angle on this. However, if you're just interested in voting reform issues generally, or frankly, almost anything, a lot of what I was going to say here, I think is kind of generally applicable. If you're particularly interested in approval voting, maybe I have some new ideas to share. And that kind of comes in more towards the end of the presentation. So again, very happy to be here. And why don't we start right now? I'll have to ask Nina or Allison to advance the slides if we can go to the first one. All right, so just starting with the basics. I found that I've looked at placing op-eds in a variety of different national and local publications all around the country, different states, different places. I thought might be kind of interesting to put an op-ed because maybe it's a state where I think that the nature of the demographics there, the people might be interested in that kind of thing. And what I found across the board is that almost all the places that would take an op-ed, they want it to be about 600 to 700 words. I think you could get away with maybe more than that if it's like an online publication that it's not like one of the major news outlets and they're more flexible with what they'll publish. They don't care as much. But if you're trying to go with what would otherwise be considered a traditional newspaper, even if most of their content at this point is online, you're going to have about a 600 to 700 word limit. I've actually found that quite tricky to stay within. This is so much I want to say. But it actually is good for forcing you to focus. And as I'll mention maybe in a few slides, it kind of is helpful rather than trying to sell the kitchen sink in a single op-ed, maybe pick a certain subtopic that you're going to make the theme and focus on. I found it's hard to get published in the big national newspapers. I've tried and failed with the New York Times, and for a while I had a dialogue with the editor at the New York Post. I was trying to get something published there, but he's like, well, this isn't really the kind of thing that we publish. And my sense is that I think if I were a professor of politics or someone who just obviously, was like an expert in the area, as opposed to a litigator who for some reason is doing this as a side interest, that might have had more panache, that I might have had more luck. If any of you are able to, pitch yourselves that way as a clear expert in the field who's credentialed, you may have more luck. So by all means, I think you should try in the first instance to go with the biggest outlet you can go with. But just to be, mindful going into this, that you may ultimately have more luck with local newspapers or some of the online journals that exist. Another thing that I run into as a practical issue is that many of the newspapers or traditional outlets will have a paywall. So if you want to then share your article after you've published it, people might say, hey, that's great, you published something, but I can't access it unless I buy a subscription. Some of them, they'll let people view an article or two before they block them. So you may want to check to see if that's the kind of outlet that you're publishing through. But it's just something to keep in mind, whether you care about that. As I note here, most of these places insist that whatever you're sending them be new and exclusive to them initially. Now, most of them, I think, would then say, after they've run it for some number of weeks or whatever, you can then republish it elsewhere. So that'll get around the paywall problem eventually. You can, put it out on some other website or some other platform that doesn't have a paywall afterwards. And also, again, I might make note here, no anonymous submissions. They want to see who you are. They want to understand who's sending them an article. We can go to the next slide. So what are they looking for? I think probably for me, the most important thing I took away from this is the second bullet point. They want to make sure that whatever they're getting is something from a reputable source. And they don't want to publish something that's going to come back to bite them, that somebody's going to say, hey, wait a minute, you put out this article, you let somebody put out this article, but it's all wrong, and it sort of demonstrably contains false information. So here again, if you are an expert in the field and you're credentialed, that may be enough for them. They'll think, okay, this is somebody who clearly knows what they're talking about. If you don't have that credentialing, then you got to make sure that you provide a lot of information to support what you're saying. Usually the way I've tried to do that is with hyperlinks, which is frankly what most of these places ask for. They want you to pepper your article with hyperlinks to what's the source information for that. And actually something that occurred to me, maybe I can follow around with a supplement that could get distributed, is I found a lot of nice places online that have interesting polling data and that kind of thing, that is sort of objective, factual information that's useful. And I'll get to this a little bit later in more detail. But for example, there's an organization that does a lot of very high quality polling on trying to find what are the sort of common ground positions that you could get a supermajority support for across the electorate. So issues that might otherwise seem to be contentious, is there a sort of middle ground position that you would actually get most people to sign on to? And they found indeed there is. So, for most issues, like whether it's gun control or abortion or whatever, you can get a large supermajority approval on certain policy positions. And it's just a matter of being able to articulate what those policy positions are, and you get a lot of support for them. And there's polling around it, which is quite useful. And something in general, I think that anyone interested in voting reform, and particularly approval voting, that needs to be the kind of data that we ultimately get more of. Because one of the gating things, I think, in these sort of presentations or discussions you have with somebody, you're trying to explain what the value is, how can you depolarize people, is to show that, in fact, if you dig in on the data, there is a supermajority consensus across most of the electorate on a lot of issues. And it's just that those formulations of what those policy positions are not being made. And we need people to be able to make them and to be able to get elected on them. So I say here also, the article should be written in a way that most people could understand it, no technical jargon, and it should have a rational tone to it. I think maybe it goes without saying, but nobody wants to publish something that sounds like a rant or uses a lot of adjectives unnecessarily. This is a lesson I've learned from litigation. When we submit briefing and make arguments to a judge, the judges are a little bit like parents that have squabbling kids, and they kind of don't want to hear all the nonsense. They want to just cut to the chase, just the facts. They can make their own decision based on the facts, and I think that's generally a good policy for op-eds as well. We need to go to the next slide. So each of these different outlets, they'll have some website usually you can find and look up that has their policies or protocols for what they want. Please make sure you follow that. There's a very quick way that they could just reject you if you're over their word limit, or you didn't include hyperlinks they wanted, or whatever. So you have to follow that to the letter just to kind of get in the door. Now, usually what they want is for you to send them an email, or they may have a submission app where you have to paste something in, but typically they just want to have the text pasted in. So it's within an email, as opposed to attaching a copy. Part of that may be a cybersecurity issue. I don't think they want to be downloading or opening attachments, but make sure that you're pasting it into the body of the email. What I've done is usually have a short lead in, just a few sentences that says, well, who am I and why should they bother reading what I'm about to send them? So I'd recommend that you have that as well, because certainly, I think it's so many submissions, and probably a lot of them are from people that, right out of the gate, they'll start reading something. And if they sense that they don't think you know what you're talking about, or, why should they even bother listening to what you have to say? they'll probably just put it aside before even reading it. So if there's something you can do to capture their attention, to make them realize just in the first sentences of an introduction to an email that there's some reason why they should listen to you, and you have something interesting to say, you know what you're talking about. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so what other things could you do that would attract attention? And this, in the first instance, is really as much just for the editors to get them to be interested in wanting to even publish. And then after that, it's to get people to read it. So it works on both levels. The title, I think, is tremendously important. And this is something I've gone back and forth many times on, and particularly in some of the drafts I'm working on, as to what title to use. You know, how do you convey in just a few words this concept? And it's tricky. I mean, it's definitely something that requires a lot of thought. And, you know, honestly, I think I've probably spent as much time thinking about what to title the article as writing the article itself. Something that I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a myriad different potential readers and what they might take away from it. Does it sound too bold or too loud, or does it sound not compelling enough? You know, so there's some middle ground you want to hit in there. You don't want to make it sound too like it's exaggerated, because that's maybe off-putting. But on the other hand, you don't want to make it sound too subdued and it sounds uninteresting. So there's some sweet spot where you're able to quickly explain the gist of what you're about to say. I've seen this trend, and you probably have too, in a lot of op-eds these days, where the sort of the credentialing is in the title, where the person will say, "I'm a doctor. This is what you should do." You know, something like that, or, you know, I'm an ex-congressman. This is what I think of something, and it has that sort of bio in the first two words. If you have some compelling bio or whatever your position is, you may want to consider doing that and having that be right in the title, since that seems to be a common type of styling of titles these days. And then also the opening sentence, you know, something that very quickly explains where you're going. And this is another thing I've learned from litigation and brief writing, and you have to just get right to the point. Like, you know, you sit down to write something and you think, well, I'll kind of get to, I have to lay some foundation or exposition, and then I'll get to my point later. For something that's 600, 700 words that people are just scrolling on a screen, and, you know, they're looking at it between lunch and responding to some other email, it needs to be something that immediately grabs the attention, quickly explains what the reason is for existence of this, whatever you're writing. So don't save it for later. You're going to have a big revelation, or at least hint at what the revelation is in the first sentence. Maybe that's the hook. So, you know, but something that's catchy, grabbing, you know, right out of the gate. And you know, I think one of the articles that I had done, I think it started with something like, you know, what if there were a way that we could make a simple change to the voting system that could you know, help eliminate polarization, or, you know, start with a question, something like that. I forget exactly how I worded it. But, you know, that I think is kind of attention grabbing. You know, it explains where you're going, and then it kind of makes them want to stick around to hear the answer. So let's go to the next slide. All right, and then in terms of this is the concept of having a main point. You know, as I said, I started out when I thought about putting together the op-eds with an idea of trying to explain, in my instance, all of approval voting kind of in one shot. And it's taken me a while to realize that that's very hard to do. There's just so many different angles. There's so many different sort of preemptive responses to the usual lines of questioning or critique that could be done. And I came around to the conclusion that it's sort of a disservice to try to do too much in one article. You may, whatever points you're trying to make, may get lost in the shuffle, and it may not be as compelling as if maybe you just focus on a particular angle. So, you know, it's going to approval voting. Let's say that, you know, it has multiple benefits. Maybe you pick one of those, and that is the what you're choosing to write about. You know, And then if you can pick a topic, a specific thing, then that can focus like a lens the rest, and it kind of flows. Then what's the title going to be? All right, well, now the title should address this particular topic you've chosen. And then the first sentence, whatever it is that you've picked as your particular topic that you want to emphasize, or so forth, that should be exactly what you say in your first sentence, or at least hint at, or lead in on. And then the article can be organized around that theme or concept. There's a draft, for example, of an article I'm working on now that I was trying to sort of marry up my background with litigation, with approval voting, and sort of analogizing the solution that it offers to a settlement in a litigation, which to me, it felt sort of, there was a certain similar in spirit concept there. So I was titling the article, a litigator's proposal for harmonizing politics, or I think I had a couple different working titles, but sort of once I picked that concept and theme, that then goes to the title. It's the first sentence, and then usually try to tie it back in the end. You conclude on the same note, and that sort of bundles it together in a way that is coherent and more compelling, I think. We can go to the next slide. All right, so what are some typical hurdles? For any, this is maybe applies more generally to any sort of voting reform topic that people might be interested in, not just approval voting, but for anybody. I mean, I'm assuming that folks who are on this call have some interest in voting reform, to the extent that you're into this, you've been into this for a while, the issues, you're familiar with people that work in the space, and you kind of, you're just in it in a way that the average citizen is not, and that the average, more to the point, editor of one of these newspapers is not. And so you have to be able to pull back and know your audience of, who are you presenting this to? What's their level of knowledge going to be? What prejudices are they unknowingly bringing to the topic before you even open your mouth and told them anything? And the first thing to realize is that I feel like I've learned this lesson, is that the vast majority of people just don't know a thing about voting reform. That's just not something that's on their radar. Maybe in certain places they've implemented ranked choice and now they've heard of that. But even those people, I think, don't understand exactly what it is, frankly, most of them. And so my assumption going in, and I might be wrong, but the assumption I start with is that whatever editor I am submitting this to is not going to really know what this is about. And I think that's a safer place to start. And it also, I think, helps with the writing. We have the same problem with brief writing and litigation. So let's say we have a case that concerns an area of law that is kind of specialized. So let's say we have a copyright case, or a trade secret case or something. The first thing that we do as the litigators is look up, once we get assigned the judge, we look up the judge. Look, who is this person? What experience they have? And if we see that they've had no prior experience with intellectual property cases, or whatever it is that we're dealing with, or I got a case now, it's about gaming law, dealing with casinos and things like that. And if the judge doesn't have experience in that area, then it dramatically changes how we write the briefing and how we submit the argument, because now we're in the role of an educator, where we have to explain from first principles what this topic even is. So certainly you want to, this goes back to, not using jargon, etc. Assume you're starting with a blank slate. Someone who their notion of voting is that, they get a ballot and they check a box and that's it. And so assume that that's the level of knowledge of whoever you're submitting to, and write to that, and with an eye towards being an educator and explaining. Those who are familiar with ranked choice, I found that's the only other voting option they're aware of. They're not aware there's anything else. They just assume that it's either, for first past the post plurality voting or ranked choice and that's it. And like, what else would there be? So the fact that there even is anything else is something that is like a new concept that needs to not just be assumed. And then many, I think, just are kind of, you know, there's so much that's out there in the media that's been there for so long that has just insisted that the country is polarized, half the country hates the other half of the country, hand-wringing about how there's no solution, that many people just assume that, well, that must be true. You know, why would I read that everywhere if that weren't true? And they're going to start with that assumption. And so you need to sort of write in a way that you're acknowledging that that may be the position they're starting from, and, you know, explaining why you're offering something that actually really is a solution as opposed to just more hand-wringing. Also, there's some, I've often encountered people who invoke the one person, one vote as something that they think is preclusive of other voting systems, and something that may need to be addressed or explained in an op-ed to kind of preemptively address that issue. If we go to the next slide. As much as given what I said before about trying to reach people, the reality is you're not going to be able to reach everybody. And there's some people that be so ingrained on whatever their view is, or, you know, whatever the preconceived notions of the thing is, that you're never going to be able to convince them. And so you as much as you want to try to write to educate, write to try to persuade, you know, realize you're only gonna be able to do so much. And, you know, you don't have to go so overboard, because, you know, if there's someone who's going to read it, who's going to be inclined to think, hey, there's something interesting about this, I want to learn more about it, you know, hopefully whatever you can put in there will capture their attention on its own merits without you having to try to jazz it up. And, you know, I think maybe I make this point somewhere on another slide too, about, you know, not using too many adjectives and so forth. You know, again, this is something we do in litigation. I tell all the junior associates, I handle training at the law firm for our junior associates, and I say, you know, if you have to use adjectives or bold and underline and all that, you know, you're doing yourself a disservice. It's a little bit like, I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Inception, but this was a famous Christopher Nolan movie, and there's a premise in the movie that they're trying to persuade someone to do something that if they tried to just tell him to do it, he'd never do it. They had to convince him that was his own idea. And so we do this with litigation briefing, where we just present the facts, and we present it in such a way that the reader should be compelled to say, well, I know what the conclusion should be based on this, you know, without you having to bold, underline, and use adjectives too much. I usually go through briefs now and I cross out all the adjectives. And then going back to this slide here, you know, my belief, just from having existed in the United States and traveled around a lot for a long time and spoken to a lot of people, is that there's a lot of people that want concrete solutions. There's a lot of people that do not want to feel that they have to be at war with people over politics. That these things might generate clicks in mass media. And I think in that sense, we're sort of evolutionarily driven to the top of news feeds, because people are sort of interested in the same way they're interested in looking at the cover of a tabloid, interested in hearing about people fighting. But they themselves, I don't know, are fighters, or they're not inclined to be at war with a neighbor. And if you can present a message that is providing a concrete solution, and my hope is that people would read your articles and they think, well, finally, somebody else who actually wants to find an answer, get people to work together. And this is what I've been waiting to hear, you know, kind of like an aha moment, a revelation, you know, as opposed to just hearing all the usual banter about people that can't get along and we're intractably in a two-party stalemate in the politics. Or worse yet, you know, some of you may have seen this now trickle into media, is references to civil war, which I find to be a remarkably offensive angle to take in any news publication, and very disrespectful of the past and what it took to get the country where it is. So hopefully your message can be one of positivity and things that my own belief is most people actually do want to hear, and they'll appreciate your article for it. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this now starts to get a little bit more into approval voting specifically, but hopefully there's concepts in here that no matter what your interest is, and maybe we've got some folks in the call that are ranked choice people, that's fine too. Some of this I think translates. So I'm doing it from the perspective I'm familiar with, but hopefully this is something that people may feel is, generally applicable. They can take some value out of this. So, I mean, I think that it's necessary, going back to sort of educating, it has to say somewhere in the article what approval voting is. I don't know that should be probably not the first sentence, because again, I think you want to organize around some kind of theme of, what is the benefit of approval voting that you're advocating in the article, and that's the first sentence. But shortly after that in the article, you'd want to get to, well, what the hell are you even talking about? Because most people are not going to know what approval voting is. This formulation here that I have on the slide, I've used before, something succinct, quick. I always throw in that the votes are counted equally and not ranked, because I find that the vast majority of people, if they're not familiar with it, will assume you're talking about ranking, which is just, obviously this is different than that. And in the articles I've worked on so far, I've also then tied it back to something that people are familiar with. So I think there's a line in one of the articles that I have now is, you may not have heard of approval voting, but you already know how it works. Because, and then I go into how this is, in fact, if you were with a group of friends, you're going to pick a restaurant together, you're going to pick a day of the week that was best to hold a meeting. This is what you do naturally without thinking about it. People volunteer a group of options that they find to be acceptable, regardless of which one they think is their favorite. And you find what's the one that has the most overlap in the group, like a Venn diagram. And that's how groups of people from time immemorial have made decisions. And so tying it back to something that, look, this isn't some strange foreign concept that we're introducing here. We're just putting a name on something you've already done your whole life and just didn't realize it. And why not apply that to politics? Why not apply that to a system where people otherwise forced into this intractable two-party stalemate because they're only given one option to pick? I think, the non-partisan aspect, again, going back to people's preconceived notions, most people, you just mention something about politics, something clicks in the head, and they go into sort of a fight or flight mode where they're trying to analyze: are you Republican, are you Democrat, what's your angle, who are you trying to help here, which, the blue team or the red team, and if there's something you can do to unring that bell and say, look, this is a nonpartisan thing. This is not about red team, blue team. This is about how to achieve supermajority consensus. This is something that everyone from anybody who's in the 80% of people who are in the middle of the bell curve should be interested in. If you're one of the people that are extreme on the far ends of the bell curve, then you're going to hate this, because this is going to disenfranchise you. So those people can leave the room. You want to be able to convey that, you don't have any angle on this. It's not a political party thing. This is just a neutral way of trying to achieve the supermajority consensus. And then I give some concrete examples, because that's the next thing people always say is, well, who's ever done this before? And in addition to St. Louis and Fargo, which I usually work in reference to, and you can include a hyperlink there, by the way, to information about that. I know that we just had some success in Utah, so there's some new news there to maybe report on. And in fact, for anybody who's got time to do something quickly while the iron is hot, talk about something to kind of focus and organize an article around. There's something. There was just a development in Utah, last week. So, there could be an article on that, and then tie into, past success in St. Louis and Fargo and so forth. And then with ranked choice, I don't always necessarily address it specifically in detail, but something that I think implicitly, if someone who's only familiar with ranked choice read your article, they should come away at least understanding what's different about approval voting, even if you don't specifically compare and contrast in detail. Let's go to the next slide. Positivity. Yeah, I think, so much out there is negative. To me, the whole underlying thematic of approval voting and voting reform generally is something as a positive message. It's people who believe that there is a way of bringing people together. And that, I think, should come out in the tone of any article. Having it be, what I found is that a lot of times a given sentence you write could be framed in the negative or the positive. It could be something that is critiquing something or being critical of something and saying, oh, well, this system doesn't work and it's never worked, so we have to change it. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe there's a positive way to say that. Say, what if there was a way to actually bring people together? Well, now you're saying the same thing conceptually, but you've put a positive spin on it instead of a negative, critical thing. And I think that this is a little bit like, people say, they may not always remember everything about a person, but they'll remember the way that person made them feel. I think it may work a little bit like that with articles, that, they might not remember ultimately a lot of the detail of what you wrote, but they'll remember, hey, that was that really positive, upbeat thing that I read that was, presenting a solution to this problem. And it sticks with me because of that. And now I want to go back and learn more about it. So I think it ultimately has greater staying power, and it's the difference between a positive reinforcement and a negative reinforcement. And I made the point here again about the minimizing the adjectives, the inception point. So hopefully the reader will be able to come to their own conclusion of this being a positive, hopeful concept. If we go to the next slide. So what I tried to do here was give some examples now in the next few slides as to, I was saying before about maybe pick an angle, pick a particular topic, some perspective on it. So angle one here is the concept of uniting people. Again, it's something positive. One of the op-eds that I did in the Fulcrum, I try to put the word unite in the title, and I think I titled it a one-word ballot change to unite our democracy. And I was trying to cram some different concepts there into one succinct title, but using that word unite, which is a positive word, and it kind of, you can organize an article around that concept of uniting people. So what are some of the concepts that flow from the angle of uniting? The polling on supermajority, and I noticed somebody put something in the comments about maybe having some nice polling information, which is fantastic. I think everybody's got to kind of get together and put that all together somewhere, because I think it's just gold to have the polling on that. I found that a polling that tries to prove the opposite, that tries to prove that people are polarized, usually the polling is prejudiced in the way it is done, because it'll frame it in terms of, X% of Democrats say this, or X% of Republicans say that. They already, from the inception of the poll, already segregated it. And it wasn't, or it was done in a way where it was polling people in a way they didn't have, much like mirroring the voting system itself. It didn't give them options. Like, they could either pick that they liked one extreme or the other extreme, and there wasn't any middle ground presented as to, well, would you support a middle ground position? So that kind of polling is very important, and I think is necessary for an article like this, to back it up with real information. I saw somebody, it was on a T-shirt or something somewhere, and it said, a person without data is just another person who has an opinion, and so you really need data to back this up. I think, to me, it went without saying from my own experience, and I had this picture of a bell curve here, which is another concept about uniting. To me, everything in nature falls in a bell curve, the same thing with political views. And, so there's not two humps like a camel. There's clearly a large hump in the middle, and the question becomes, well, how do you get the 80% of the people that are clustered around the hump of the bell curve to be able to form a united voting bloc instead of getting artificially split off into two camps, so that they could unite? And really, there's a concept of a common enemy in a way that I think is powerful. That always brings people together, is this notion of a common enemy. To me, and I haven't quite been able to figure out a way to articulate this yet in the form of an article, but it's something that I'd like to work on, is the common enemy in a way has been the very concept that we're divided. Like this messaging that's put out there of, you should be at war with your neighbor, we can't get along, and the best you could hope for is half the country hating the other half of the country. To me, that's the common enemy. That messaging is preventing us from being able to move forward together and do things and accomplish things. It presents to me a national security risk. I mean, if we're so disorganized that, half of Congress can't agree with the other half of Congress, then we're not going to be able to rise to the challenges we need to for the future. So that the very division itself, I find to be a sort of a common enemy for the 80% of reasonable people that would like to be able to find a way to work together. I make a mention here of this apple pie analogy. This was something that I'd come up with. I think other people have used similar formulations. I think somebody used something about pizza, but to explain where approval voting had an advantage in terms of bringing people together, that instead of sort of forcing people to polarize around two first choice picks, which often would happen, I think, in many ranked choice elections, where you kind of, most of the votes end up going to the people that are on, one side or the other, and the people in the middle, their purpose is often, it's like a center squeeze effect, it's called, where they get split off to support one of the other two people on the other side, rather than the people in the middle being the ones that get the most votes. And the analogy I was using was, and feel free, anybody wants to use this analogy, that if there were two people go into a pie store to buy pie, let's say they're shopping for the family for Thanksgiving, and they have to pick a pie, and the first person says, well, my favorite pie is blueberry, I want blueberry pie. The second person says, well, my favorite pie is cherry pie, I want cherry pie. Now, in our existing voting system, first past the post is going to be election between blueberry and cherry, and somebody's going to come out unhappy, let's say with more than two people. But what do most people do in that situation? They say, hey, what's your second favorite pie? And the first person might say, well, I like apple. Apple's pretty good. I like that. And the other person, oh, I like apple too. That's my second favorite. So what pie are they going to buy? They buy apple pie. Now, in a ranked choice election, apple pie would have got ranked out because it was everybody's second choice. And you would have had a runoff between blueberry and cherry, and somebody's going to be unhappy. So I've used that analogy to kind of get across the power of approval voting to unite people around the common choice, that would, the way they would naturally do in most settings and group decision making. I mentioned here this Nash equilibrium. If anybody's tied into finance, I'd be fascinated to do a deep dive with anybody in economics on this. Some people may know Professor Nash. He was famous for coming up with this Nash equilibrium concept in economics. There was a movie made about him called A Beautiful Mind. He suffered from some mental disturbances. But this concept of the Nash equilibrium in economics was that it's a game theory concept, that if everybody was trying to get their maximum benefit from a certain game or circumstance, they may end up canceling each other out. But if they coordinate around a certain sort of mutually beneficial option, they actually end up maximizing the result they'll get out of the system. And it's directly analogous to approval voting, in my view, and something I'd love to see economists talk about as like a game theory concept. We can go to the next slide. And I know that we're maybe running up on time here because I wanted to leave some room for discussion or questions. So I'll try to run through these. Another angle might focus on the simplicity of approval voting. Our current election system can get a little complicated. A lot of the other voting systems that are advocated can, also themselves be a little complicated. Ranked choice, requires most instances having a computer program that runs the instant runoffs and calculates, what the results are. My own belief, I think most people don't really understand how that works. They think they know how it works. Most people I've spoken to that have some threshold knowledge of ranked choice voting assume it's a scoring system where all the votes are counted, which is not true. That's not accurate. A lot of and I think the data shows in most ranked choice elections, the two people that got the most first choice votes, one of those is going to be the winner. For the people who voted for those as their first choice, whoever they picked as a second and third choice is just discarded and never counted. So like going back to my apple pie analogy, the fact that those two pie shoppers both would have liked getting apple pie is never appreciated because that vote is rejected from the system. It's not counted. So that's something I think is not quite understood. This played out in a similar scenario as this played out in the Alaska election between, it was Piltola and Sarah Palin and Nick Begich. And if you actually look at the data, Nick Begich, who was kind of like a centrist Republican, if you put him head to head with either of the other two, he would have won. But under the ranking system, it ended up being a little bit like my pie analogy, where because he was kind of, more of the second choice for everybody, he got kicked out. So there's a certain simplicity to approval voting of just, you just add up the votes. Whoever gets the most vote wins. And this concept of Occam's razor, which is, and that's a philosophical principle, maybe people have heard, that the simplest answer is often the right one. Some people ask me about what I think about, having an actual scoring system like a star voting. And my own view on it, I appreciate it. I like it maybe second best to approval voting, but I think it's not accomplishing the robust compromise that approval voting does. And it adds another layer of some complexity, whereas there's a certain sort of simplicity of just, we don't even have to change the ballot system. I mean, think about that. How much money is saved. We can just use our existing ballot counting machines, and all we have to do is just change the criteria so they can accept more than one vote on the same form. And a lot of, I looked into the legal side of a lot of this. A lot of the state and local regulation around voting and so forth is already set up to accommodate the concept of approval voting. In fact, a lot of places don't really have anything that mandates that it has to be first past the post, although there's I think more laws that would have to change to allow something other than that, or approval voting. It's just some extra baggage that needs to be dealt with on some other voting methods, whereas approval voting is very simple to implement, very simple to understand. Everyone will get it at the end. The person got the most votes, they won. Okay, next topic. Incentives. This actually, if I were to leave you guys with nothing else substantively, is to me the heart of the value of approval voting, and a concept that I've now shifted towards in terms of what I lead with as the most important thing. And it took me a while to articulate it. It was something that was staring me in the face in the beginning. In other voting systems, all you need is 51% to win. So the incentive for any, including ranked choice, you just need 51%. In fact, if you get 51% in round one, you don't even have to do the rest of the instant runoff. Whoever got 51% will win. In any district where you're a shoe-in with 51%, no incentive to reach to the other side of the spectrum. Maybe you might care about putting a little extra effort to capture just enough extra votes, you make sure you get 51%. But why do you not want to go further than that? Because if you go too much further into the other camp, then your base, or whoever you have as you think is your locked-in support for your half, is going to start feeling alienated. Hey, why are you talking to the people on the other side of the aisle? So the incentive structure for the politicians in a game theory sense is to try to get to 51% and really no more than that, so you don't alienate any of the people that are on your camp. The power of approval voting to me is that because it counts all the votes in the same round of voting instead of all these runoffs, if you have 51%, you can lose to somebody who got 61%, who in turn could lose to somebody who got 71%. And it creates a race for the politicians. And they say, well, wait a minute. I can't just, try to only get 51%, because if somebody else can appeal to more of that bell curve than me, then they're going to capture a larger number of votes and I'm going to lose. I'll get 51% and I'll lose. So it just fundamentally rewrites the incentive structure in a way that our existing voting systems and ranked choice do not do. And this is something that I don't think has been emphasized enough. I think that this is one of the most powerful messages. If you get people to understand it, it kind of self-organizes the incentives of the politicians around wanting to capture that 80% of the bell curve, just organically. They have to, otherwise they'll lose. And as soon as they realize that, they're going to start figuring out, well, what are the things that I could get a supermajority of people across the political spectrum to come together on? And I have to make that my platform, otherwise I'm going to lose to somebody else who does a better job of that. Go to the next slide. This I think I've kind of already covered here, so we can move ahead. And here, I think these slides will get circulated. I don't want to take too much more time. We're kind of right towards the end. I put in these last two slides here some thoughts on preemptive responses to the usual critiques. People only go vote for the first choice. I don't think so. I think if people understand the system, then if they realize that if they don't vote a certain way, that somebody dislike is going to win, then they're going to be incentivized to vote for more than one, so they're not putting all the eggs in a losing basket. And also, once the politicians change their stance and you bring in more political parties and people to get more other parties in the system trying to achieve this 80% or more consensus, I think you just change the landscape. And so this sort of concern doesn't apply. I'll skip some of the rest here. We'll go to the next slide there. I think this is the last slide, actually. The establishment won't allow it. That's maybe a common sort of concern. And certainly we've seen that happen where, this got voted down in North Dakota and so forth, which I think is remarkably short-sighted on the part of the politicians. My own belief is that most of the politicians wish they had this system of approval voting, because they feel constrained that they have to go with the party even on some position they think is ridiculous. And they would love it if they had a platform to appeal to a supermajority of the public on some rational policy position. So my own belief is that as soon as this was something that people got it would catch on. And a lot of the Republicans and Democrats who are more reasonable minded would say, hey, wait a minute, now we have a way of actually coming together. And I think if there's an article that could kind of make that apparent, and maybe even an article is directed to politicians, there's an idea. Say, hey, politicians, are you tired of being at odds with each other? Here's a way you could come together, And then finally, this concept of, oh, we haven't tested approval voting enough. Well, it's a sort of a chicken and egg problem. I mean, as I say here, approval voting could be the miracle solution we've all been waiting for, but if you applied this logic, it would never be adopted. I think in any kind of healthy democracy, you got to be able to try different things. And I think it's bad policy to try to put all your eggs in only one basket. There's more than enough different forms and jurisdictions in our very large country in which we could try this out and see how it works. My own belief is that I think most people are looking for a solution like this. I think that's the last of the slides. I'll try to stop there. I know we're kind of coming up on time, but I don't know if, Allison, Andy, should we open it up for questions or?
Yeah. So if we have any questions, we can open it up. And also if you think of questions, you can email me as well. Oh, but we have Alan. You can go ahead, Alan.
Thank you. Thanks, JP. This was a great presentation. I really feel like I learned a lot, and it helps me organize my thinking in writing an op-ed a lot. So I appreciate it very, very much. One of the things you brought up was that you think most people think they understand, or at least who have even heard of RCV, think they understand it, but maybe don't. I think I agree with that, but I haven't actually seen any hard data that points to that. I'm curious if anybody here has that kind of data, because I would love to have that in my pocket.
Well, I'll just say, but my sort of the first thing I think of with that was that Alaska election, because I think that a lot of people, you know, it's interesting because the data on it that was released was not complete. Like if you went to like the Alaska elections website, what was actually published, it didn't show all of the rankings that people did. It just kind of cut to the end. And I think a lot of people looked at, especially if you were someone who wanted a Democrat to win, you wanted Patola to win, it was just immediately hailed as, oh, this system's great because it got the Democrat to win.
Yeah.
It made sure that Sarah Palin didn't win. And there wasn't enough of peeking behind the curtain and looking at the actual numbers to realize, well, wait a minute, if you put Begich up against Patola in a one-on-one election, according to the data on how people ranked, he would have won. And the fact that that was not publicized and the media hadn't picked it up, I did see there was one Harvard politics professor who picked up on it and wrote an article and said, yeah, this didn't really quite come out right. And he kind of explained why. And he was proposing some very convoluted solution to it. And as I was reading it, it was like he was sort of trying to reinvent approval voting in like a weird way. And I was thinking, gee, I got to talk to this guy and tell him there's already a system that does this very efficiently and in an Occam's razor way, quite simply. But that's an example that I have where I thought that you know, it was just not understood really what those results really were.
Great, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? And Alan, we dropped some other stuff in the chat. I can also email you some of those resources and top ones that we have as well. Any other questions, folks? And if you do have questions that you think about after, you can feel free to email me. I'll drop my email in the chat. That's actually a really good question. I think that's Adam. That is, what is the value of op-eds as opposed to blog posts or other written works? It's a good question.
It's an excellent question. I was actually going to put a bit of a disclaimer in this that, you know, I'm not really addressing ways of, you know, going viral and social media and so forth. My own sense of it is that if you can get a nice op-ed out there, especially if it's something where you're kind of forced into the succinctness of something that's, you know, 600 words or less, that it could be something that then gets circulated, that maybe enough people would find that and say, hey, you know, this interesting article, it's a quick read, and then that can get forwarded around in other social media as like a blog post. And it has, I think, maybe perhaps some more authority to it, because you've had to go through the ringer of, you know, making it get past an editorial board. And so it has a certain aura of authority to it that just a random post might not. That's what I think perhaps a benefit could be. But I would say that if you have a way of getting yourself to go viral from just a blog posting, then by all means, you know, I think whatever gets the message out there, it's something that I would claim to be as much of an expert in. And not that I'm an expert in anything, I'm just sharing my own personal experience and advice.
And Alan, I think we'll just, if he has another follow-up, we could take that and then kind of wrap it up. Do you have another question?
Yeah, I do have a couple more, hopefully quick ones. One is sort of related to this last one. Like, could we have another similar meeting to this where we talk about like emailing or contacting your representatives? Because I feel like a lot of the information is the same of what you want to get across, but there might be subtly different things that maybe some people who have more experience in reaching out to their representatives and have had success, I'm thinking like Nate Allen or someone like that, could share with us about what works, how long do you make it, who do you reach out to, how do you find the people to reach out to? Oh, okay, and there's probably a thing I should already have watched. And then the other question I had is, yeah, in terms of finding the newspaper or the outlet to reach out to, do you have any more advice in that direction of, do you kind of like do a broad search of what are all the outlets in my area and then and then rate them in terms of how far their reach is and how much I can, like, how do you do that search to begin with, to get started?
I'll speak to that one. Your first question, I might pass that to Nina or Allison, but on that question, I've looked at a lot of different news outlets across the country over the past few years. And while I do think that you may have more luck with something that's local, to the extent that they see that you may be a reader or you're someone from the community, I don't think you need to be constrained to that. Like I got something published in the Salt Lake Tribune. I live in Los Angeles, not Salt Lake City, and that wasn't an impediment. Alan, somebody like you, I mean, you're kind of in this. Your whole job description seems to be around, voting reform. My guess is that you'd have a bit more luck maybe with almost any publication, because you present as an expert in the field. For someone like me, who my job title is litigator, and it's not immediately apparent what I have to do with voting reform. What I've tried to do is pick jurisdictions that I thought might have some interest in this. Like maybe it's a place that might be kind of a purple city, and that they might have a leaning towards wanting to hear about a solution that brings people together. I also looked for where the editorial boards for certain newspapers had already released their own op-eds that were advocating in favor of not necessarily even voting reform, but trying to bring people together. There was, I think it was at the one of the newspapers in Dallas or something, they'd had a very compelling article about this whole notion of uniting people around supermajority consensus positions, and they had included a lot of nice polling and pie charts, and it was from the editorial board. They took the time to put it together, and I thought, okay, well, here's some people that already have a prepackaged interest in this. Now, I haven't reached out to them yet, but they're kind of on my list. I kind of made note of that. So you may look to see if they, sometimes editorial boards will have some mission statement or mission purpose, and they may say explicitly in that they're looking for, they like to advance, non-partisan, fact-driven positions, or something that signals that they might be receptive to, this kind of thing.
Cool. Okay, great. That actually gives me one more follow-up question, if I can. Sorry, everyone. And it gets back to this idea of kind of the biography in the title and my experience, because I have had two careers. One as a software engineer, where I was a senior software engineer at Google, and I can kind of attack things from that perspective. And in fact, that's where like the majority of my training is. Or I can come out as the person who's leading this organization that's advocating for approval reform, at the risk, which makes me maybe seem like more of an expert in the area, but also maybe seems more like I'm just like pandering or trying to push my own agenda rather than like propose an honest solution. And I'm curious what your take on that is.
I would say that if you had a way of framing your article as something that was building off of your experience as a software engineer, like I was giving that example of, I've got a draft article I'm working on where it's like a litigator's perspective, like that's literally that angle on the article, then I think that there's value to presenting yourself that way and saying, I'm looking at this from the perspective of a software engineer, maybe trying to optimize a system, or, if you had to write code to optimize a complex system, how would you do it? And analogizing that to sort of the organizing principles around approval voting, then it's valuable to come at it from that perspective. I would think that if it was more of a straight up discussion of policy, politics, and voting reform, you're better served highlighting the fact that you're in the field, because I think that most editorial boards would be inclined to accept that as threshold evidence that you have some idea what you're talking about. Yeah, that's my own my own sense of it from my own experience.
Thank you.
And like I said, Alan, if you have more questions or you just kind of like want to chat further, I'm sure we can facilitate that as well, because there's just a lot that's going on recently. So we're we're more than happy to facilitate these conversations. But I just wanted to wrap up here. Thanks everyone who has stayed a little later. Thank you so much, JP. This was really helpful. We will be sending out the slides, it's not a transcript. There's like a little notes app that ends up getting some notes from the meeting. And then we also send out the video as well. So you should have all of the things here that you need. And hopefully if you have any more questions, don't feel free to email us. We like to have continuous conversations with folks. We also have a Discord community that you can go and ask lots of questions. We have lots of expertise in the Discord. If you have any questions whatsoever, we know that you can get an answer there. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. And we hope to see you in future trainings, because we continue to have these conversations in this sort of political climate, so that you all have the tools that you need to advocate for the things that you care about. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a nice, what is this, Wednesday? Have a nice Wednesday evening, afternoon.
I just wanted to also say thanks everybody for attending. And you know, I'll ask Allison and Nina to include my contact information, whatever gets circulated. Anybody who might want to reach out. Unfortunately, I don't know most of you, but I'd love to meet you or talk to you. Regardless of whatever you want to talk about, it would be nice to meet you. I appreciate you attending, and hopefully there was something interesting about it. And have a great day. Thank you so much.